The dog's hind legs were twisted at an angle that made Dean's stomach drop. 5 days in the Mojave sun. Spine fractured, skin splitting over infected bone, too weak to even flinch at the flies covering its wounds. Any other rider would have kept going, but Dean Hargrove pulled his Harley to the shoulder and did something nobody in Barstow expected from a man wearing a Hells Angels patch. When word reached the other chapters about what he'd found and what he did next, 400 bikers descended on a town that had spent decades fearing every one of them. What happened in that veterinary clinic left the toughest men in the room unable to speak. The heat in Barstow, California, had a way of turning the whole desert into a shimmering mirage by mid-morning. In late August, when the temperature crept past 110 degrees before noon, the town's two-lane roads became ribbons of liquid light, warping the horizon until it looked like the asphalt itself was melting into the sky. Most people stayed inside. Most people had the good sense to close their blinds, crank up whatever air conditioning they could afford, and wait for the sun to stop punishing the earth. The trailer parks on the east side went silent by 10 in the morning, blinds drawn like closed eyelids, only the hum of overworked window units proving that anyone still lived inside. Dean Hargrove was not most people. He rolled his Harley-Davidson Road King down Interstate 15 with the patience of a man who had stopped rushing 20 years ago. At 57, Dean carried himself with the quiet weight of someone who had lived several lives before settling into the one he had now. His beard was silver-streaked and braided loosely against his chest. His arms were sleeved in faded tattoos, eagles, engine pistons, the names of brothers he'd buried, and his leather cut bore the insignia of the Desert Hawks chapter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. The patches told a story most people didn't want to read. They saw the skull, they saw the wings, they crossed the street. That was fine with Dean. He'd learned through years of casual hostility from cashiers, cops and crossing guards that a man wearing a 1%er patch lived inside a story other people had already written for him. He could smile, hold doors, tip well, speak softly, and still watch the discomfort settle across someone's face like a curtain falling. After a while, you stopped performing for an audience that refused to watch. You rode with the men who knew you, you did the work you believed in, and you let the rest of the world think whatever it needed to think in order to sleep at night. He was riding back from a supply run to Victorville, his saddlebags loaded with bottled water and canned goods for the chapter's annual fundraiser, a detail the Barstow Gazette had never once reported, despite covering every noise complaint the club generated. The fundraiser had been running for 11 years, quietly feeding families in the trailer parks east of town, and every year the only people who showed up to help were the ones the rest of Barstow pretended didn't exist. Dean had started it after the recession hollowed out the town's economy, when he'd seen children lining up for free lunch at the elementary school and realized that the line stretched longer every month. Dean downshifted as he approached the exit ramp near Ghost Town Road, the engine growling low beneath him. That's when he saw it. A shape on the gravel shoulder just past the overpass shadow. Small, brown, motionless except for a faint rhythmic trembling. He almost kept going. Stray animals in the Mojave were as common as tumbleweeds. But something about the way this shape didn't move, not a flinch, not an attempt to flee as the motorcycle's roar filled the overpass, made him ease off the throttle. Dean pulled the Harley onto the shoulder, killed the engine, and swung his leg over the seat. The silence that followed was enormous, just the ticking of hot metal and the dry whisper of wind across sand. The dog was lying on its side in the dust, ribs showing through matted fur the color of rust. It was a medium-sized mutt, maybe 40 pounds, though it was hard to tell with the emaciation. Its eyes were open, watching Dean with the kind of stillness that comes when an animal has used up every last resource for survival and has nothing left but breath. Dean crouched 3 feet away. The dog's hind legs were wrong, not broken exactly, but limp, dragged out behind the body at an angle that suggested the spine or the hips had failed. There was dried blood around the base of the tail, and when Dean leaned closer, he saw it. A deep, infected wound running along the dog's lower back, swollen and crusted, buzzing with flies. The smell hit him a second later, that thick, sweet rot of tissue dying slowly in the sun. He pulled his bandana from his back pocket, soaked it with water from his saddlebag, and set it near the dog's muzzle. A tongue, pale and dry, reached out and touched the wet fabric. Dean pulled out his phone and called Marcus Tate, his chapter's sergeant-at-arms, and the only person he knew who had spent 3 years as a veterinary technician before life took a different turn. "Mark, I got a situation out here on Ghost Town Road. Dog down, can't use its back legs. Looks like it's been here a while." A pause. Then Marcus's voice, low and steady. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I'm not leaving. I'll bring the van. 20 minutes. He didn't touch the dog. He knew better than to reach for a wounded animal whose pain threshold and tolerance for contact were unknown. Instead, he sat down in the dirt beside his motorcycle, poured water into his cupped hand, and held it out at arm's length. The dog watched but didn't move. Dean kept his hand there, steady, while the sun beat down on his shoulders and the sweat traced dark lines through the dust on his neck. A truck passed on the interstate above, shaking the overpass with a sound like distant thunder, and the dog's ears flattened, but its body remained still, too weak, too broken, too far past the point of flight. When Marcus arrived 18 minutes later in the chapter's battered white cargo van, Dean was still sitting in the same position, his hand still extended, and the dog had inched close enough to rest its chin on the edge of his palm. Marcus Tate was built like a refrigerator someone had taught to walk. 6'3", 260 pounds, with hands that looked like they could crush a cinder block. His head was shaved clean, and a scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw. When he stepped out of the van wearing his Hells Angels cut and steel-toed boots, he looked exactly like the kind of man mothers warned their children about. He also carried a first aid kit, a clean towel, and a muzzle. Not for aggression, but because he knew that pain makes any creature unpredictable. "Let me see," he said, kneeling beside Dean with a gentleness that seemed impossible given his size. He examined the dog without touching it first, his eyes scanning the wound, the position of the legs, the breathing pattern. 3 years at the veterinary clinic in Needles hadn't given him a degree, but they'd given him something textbooks couldn't: the ability to read suffering without flinching from it. He'd spent those years learning the language of animals in pain. The way a cat's pupils dilate when its abdomen is tender, the pitch of a dog's whimper that signals nerve damage versus muscle strain, the particular stillness of a creature that has stopped fighting not because it feels safe, but because it has accepted that nothing it does will change what happens next. "Blunt force trauma to the lumbar spine," Marcus said quietly. "Could be a car, could be a kick. The wound on the back is secondary, probably dragged itself over rocks trying to get to shade. This dog's been down for 5 days minimum, maybe a week. The muscle wasting in the hind legs is significant. Anything past 10 days with no movement, and those muscles start to atrophy beyond easy recovery. Can it be moved? Carefully. If the spine's fractured, wrong handling could sever what's still connected. We need to keep the back straight and support the whole body as one unit." Marcus laid the towel flat on the ground and worked with Dean to slide the dog onto it with agonizing slowness, their hands coordinating beneath the animal's body like surgeons steadying an organ. The dog whimpered once, a thin, high sound that cut through the desert air like a wire pulled taut, but didn't snap or struggle. Its eyes moved between the two men with that same exhausted watchfulness, tracking their hands, their faces, the vibration of their voices. They placed the dog in the back of the van on a bed of moving blankets Marcus kept for hauling equipment. Marcus fashioned a makeshift stabilizer from rolled towels packed against the dog's sides, keeping the spine aligned. Dean rode his Harley behind the van as they drove to the only veterinary clinic in Barstow open on a Saturday, Dr. Linda Ashworth's practice on Main Street. Dr. Ashworth had been the town's sole veterinarian for 22 years. She was 61, wiry, sharp-eyed behind wire-framed glasses, and possessed the kind of blunt pragmatism that desert living cultivates in people who last. Her clinic was small, 3 exam rooms, a surgery suite the size of a generous closet, and a recovery area that doubled as storage. But it was clean, well-equipped within its means, and open 6 days a week because Linda Ashworth believed that animals didn't schedule their emergencies around weekends. She also had a complicated relationship with the Desert Hawks. 3 years earlier, someone had slashed the tires on her clinic van in the parking lot of the Idle Spurs bar, and the rumor, never confirmed, never denied, was that it had been a club prospect trying to impress senior members. She'd never filed a report, partly because she had no proof, and partly because she'd learned that in a town like Barstow, accusations without evidence created enemies faster than justice. But she hadn't forgotten either. When Dean and Marcus carried the dog through her front door, wrapped in a blanket and barely conscious, Dr. Ashworth looked at their cuts, looked at the dog, and made a decision in the space of a breath. Whatever her feelings about the club, there was an animal on her threshold that needed help, and 22 years of veterinary practice had taught her that the worthiness of a patient was never determined by the character of whoever carried it in. Exam room 2. Put it on the table, gently. She worked quickly, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. X-rays confirmed what Marcus had suspected, a fracture in the L4 vertebra, likely from a severe impact. The spinal cord wasn't severed, but was compressed by swelling and a fragment of displaced bone. The wound was infected with 2 types of bacteria. Dehydration was severe, malnutrition was worse. This dog was hit by something, Dr. Ashworth said, pulling off her gloves. The fracture pattern is consistent with a concentrated high-force impact, more like a baseball bat than a car bumper. She let that sit in the room. It's been immobile for 5 to 7 days. Will it walk again? Dean asked. Maybe. The swelling needs to come down. Anti-inflammatories, antibiotics, IV fluids, rest. If the cord isn't permanently damaged, there's a chance. But we're talking weeks of intensive care, physical therapy, probably hydrotherapy. That's not cheap, and it's not guaranteed. How much? $4,000 to $5,000, and that's with me cutting every corner I ethically can. Marcus whistled low. Dean didn't react. He was looking at the dog on the table, its eyes half closed under the cool of the air conditioning, its breathing steadier with the IV drip running into its front leg. For the first time, he could see the shape of the animal beneath the starvation, the broad chest, the square muzzle, ears that folded forward in a way that suggested some distant retriever heritage. Start the treatment, Dean said. You understand this isn't your dog. No collar, no chip. County says strays go to the shelter, and the shelter's policy is euthanasia after 72 hours. I'm claiming it. Start the treatment. I'll figure out the money. Dr. Ashworth held his gaze for a long moment. She was accustomed to reading people, their sincerity, their follow-through, their capacity to commit to the long, expensive, uncertain road of animal recovery. Most people meant well in the first moment and disappeared by the 3rd bill. Something in Dean's expression, not emotion, not performance, but a settled, immovable certainty, told her this was different. She nodded once. I want payment arrangements in writing before the end of the week. In the parking lot, Marcus leaned against the van, the late afternoon light throwing his shadow long across the asphalt. $5 grand, brother. The fundraiser money's allocated to the penny. I know. So what's the plan? Dean looked at the road stretching east toward the compound. I'm going to ask the club. Marcus raised an eyebrow. All of them? All of them. The Desert Hawks chapter met every Thursday at their compound on the eastern edge of Barstow, a fenced acre of hard-packed dirt anchored by a concrete block clubhouse that looked from the outside like the kind of place respectable people avoided. The fence was chain-link topped with razor wire. The parking lot was always full of Harleys. The music was always too loud. The Barstow police drove by twice a night, slowing down just enough to make a point. Inside, the clubhouse was cleaner than most people would have guessed. There was a bar, a pool table, a wall of framed photographs spanning 3 decades of rides, rallies, and charity events that never made the news. A hand-painted mural of the desert at sunset covered the back wall, the work of a former member's daughter who'd spent a summer weekend transforming cinder blocks into something that looked almost sacred. There was also a kitchen where Eddie Sullivan, 63, retired Army cook, founding member, prepared meals every Thursday that were better than anything served at the diner on First Street. Dean stood at the front of the room on a Thursday evening, 2 days after finding the dog, and told the chapter what had happened. 31 men listened. Some stood with arms crossed, some sat on battered couches, a few leaned against the bar, beers untouched. He told them about the dog on Ghost Town Road. about the broken spine and the way the animal had dragged itself through gravel until its back was raw, about Dr. Ashworth's estimate and the slim but real chance of recovery. He did not embellish. He simply told them what he'd seen and what he'd done, and then he said, "I'm asking for help. Not from the fundraiser fund, that stays for the families. From us. Personal." The room was quiet. Outside, the wind pushed sand against the windows in a soft, continuous hiss. Eddie Sullivan spoke first. "What's the dog's name?" Dean blinked. "Doesn't have one." "Everything deserves a name." Eddie thought for a moment. "Ghost. Found on Ghost Town Road." A few nods around the room. The name settled over the conversation like dust settling after a truck passes. Then a voice from the back. Ray Whitfield, 44, the chapter's newest full-patch member and arguably its most skeptical. Ray was lean, angular, with a perpetual squint that made him look like he was evaluating everything and finding it lacking. He'd joined the club after a divorce and a bankruptcy that had stripped him of his house, his truck, and most of his belief that the world operated on anything other than self-interest. "So we're a dog rescue now," Ray said, pushing off the wall he'd been leaning against. "We've got a fundraiser to run in 6 weeks, bills on the compound, the roof over the kitchen leaking, and you want us to pass the hat for a stray nobody knows." "I want us to do what's right," Dean said evenly. "What's right is focusing on what we committed to. Those families east of town are counting on us. We promised them. A dog doesn't get to jump the line because it made somebody feel sorry for it. Nobody's jumping any line, and nobody's touching the fundraiser money." I said personal. Ray shook his head, his jaw tight. "It's still resources, time, attention, fuel driving back and forth to that clinic. We start doing this, where does it stop? Every roadkill on the interstate gets a benefit concert?" The room shifted uncomfortably. Ray wasn't wrong about the practical concerns, and everyone knew it. The chapter operated on thin margins. Dues, occasional mechanic work at the shop. 2 members ran on East Main, the odd sponsorship from businesses brave enough to associate with them. Every dollar mattered, and every hour spent on one thing was an hour not spent on another. These were men who understood scarcity, not as an abstract concept, but as a daily condition, a ceiling they bumped against so often they'd stopped noticing the bruises. But then Marcus stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He rarely did. "I spent 3 years cleaning kennels and holding animals while they got put down because nobody wanted them," he said. "I watched dogs that had nothing wrong with them except being unwanted get a needle in their leg and go still. I left that job because I couldn't take it anymore, but I never stopped knowing what I learned there." He looked at Ray. "That dog didn't choose to be on that road. Something put it there. Something cruel, something that hit it hard enough to break its spine and then walked away. And we found it. Not animal control, not the shelter. Us. That means something, or it doesn't. But I know which one I believe." The vote wasn't unanimous. It was 27-4. The chapter would pool personal funds to cover Ghost's treatment. Ray was one of the 4 who voted no, and nobody held it against him. That was the rule. You could disagree and still belong. Dissent wasn't disloyalty. It was the price of thinking for yourself in a room full of men who valued exactly that. Within 48 hours, the chapter had raised $3,200. Some members gave $100. Some gave $20. Eddie Sullivan emptied a coffee can he kept above the refrigerator. $740 in accumulated tips from the catering jobs he did on weekends, money he'd been saving for a fishing trip to Lake Havasu that he quietly decided could wait another year. Dean covered the remaining $1,800 from his own savings, money he'd been setting aside for a new exhaust system he'd wanted for 2 years. He didn't mention it. Dr. Ashworth accepted the payment with visible surprise, though she said nothing about it beyond a curt, "Thank you." She began Ghost's treatment that same day: anti-inflammatories, antibiotics, IV nutrition, and a pain management protocol. The dog lay on a padded mat in the recovery room, too weak to lift its head but alive, breathing, present, a small engine of persistence running on fumes. Dean visited every morning before dawn. He sat on the floor beside Ghost's mat and talked. Not to the dog exactly, but in its presence, the way people talk when they need to hear their own voice confirm that something matters. "Everybody sees the patch," he said once, to no one. "Nobody sees the man wearing it." By the end of the first week, Ghost could lift its head. By the end of the second, its front legs were strong enough to pull its body forward a few inches. The hind legs remained still, but Dr. Ashworth noted returning reflexes, faint twitches in the muscles, involuntary flexions that suggested the compressed nerves were beginning to signal again. "It's not nothing," she told Dean, "but don't get your expectations too high." Dean nodded. He'd learned a long time ago that hope was something you carried carefully, like a flame in wind. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Ghost had been found. It rippled through every chapter president in the Hells Angels Southwestern Territory, a network stretching from the California coast to the Arizona border, encompassing 17 chapters and over 400 active members. It started, as most things in the club did, with a conversation between men who trusted each other. Dean had mentioned Ghost's progress during a routine call with Rick Brennan, president of the San Bernardino chapter, a weekly check-in they'd maintained for 9 years. Rick, a storyteller by nature and a welder by trade, had been struck by the image of Dean sitting on a veterinary clinic floor at 5 in the morning talking to a paralyzed dog. He'd mentioned it to the Riverside chapter president during a ride the following weekend, who'd mentioned it to Pomona, who'd passed it to Tucson during a phone call about the upcoming memorial ride. Within 10 days, the story had traveled through the entire Southwestern network like a current through copper wire, fast, clean, and carrying energy. And then something happened that Dean hadn't anticipated and wouldn't have asked for. Chapters started sending money. Not large amounts, 50 here, 100 there, but the contributions came with messages that carried more weight than the dollars. Handwritten notes in envelopes, texts at odd hours. For Ghost, from the brothers in Flagstaff. Mesa chapter stands with you. Needles chapter chipped in. Dog deserves a shot. Each message was brief, unsentimental, and unmistakably sincere. By the end of the month, the fund had grown to over $11,000, more than double what the treatment would cost. Dean sat in the clinic's waiting room with envelopes spread across his lap, reading each note a second time, and found himself unable to formulate a response equal to what he felt. He wasn't a man given to large emotion. He processed the world through action, through presence, through the deliberate choice to keep showing up. But this evidence that 400 men he'd never asked had decided, independently and without coordination, to care, settled into his chest like a weight he didn't mind carrying. Dr. Ashworth had a practical answer. Use the surplus for Ghost's ongoing care and physical therapy. This is going to be a long road. And if there's still money left after that, I know a shelter in Needles that's about 30 days from closing its doors. 40 animals in there with nowhere to go. It was during Ghost's 4th week that the turning point arrived. Not in the dog's spine, but in the town's perception. The Barstow Gazette received an anonymous tip about the story. The editor assigned it to Sarah Mitchell, a 28-year-old reporter hungry for something more meaningful than city council recaps. Sarah called Dean. He almost didn't answer. Decades of media interactions had taught him that reporters came with predetermined narratives. But something in her voicemail, a straightforward request to hear what happened in his own words, made him call back. She asked a question most reporters never bothered with. What would you want people to understand about this that they probably don't? They met at the clinic. Dean didn't soften his appearance or hide his patches. He sat beside Ghost's recovery mat, where the dog could now sit upright with its front legs braced, and told Sarah the same thing he'd told his chapter. People see the cut and they make up their minds, he said. I've been called every name you can think of. Had mothers pull their kids away from me at gas stations. Had cops follow me for miles, hoping I'd roll through a stop sign. Had a waitress refuse to take my order because her manager told her not to serve anyone wearing club colors. He scratched the back of his neck. I'm not saying we're saints. We're not. But we're not what they think either. Most of us are just guys who found a family when nobody else wanted us. Sarah's article ran the following Sunday. It was factual, restrained, and carefully reported, with quotes from Dean, Marcus, Dr. Ashworth, and 2 other chapter members who agreed to speak on the record. It was accompanied by a single photograph, Dean sitting on the clinic floor, Ghost's head resting against his boot, the man's tattooed hand resting on the dog's shoulder. The headline read, "Desert Hawks Rally to Save Paralyzed Dog, Found on Ghost Town Road." The response was immediate and overwhelming. The clinic's phone rang non-stop for 3 days. Donations arrived from people who had never spoken to a Hells Angels member and probably never would. Checks in envelopes, cash in greeting cards. A hardware store owner who had refused to serve club members for 6 years left $500 at the front desk with no return address. The elementary school on Irwin Road organized a card-making campaign, and 37 hand-drawn Get Well cards arrived in a shoebox addressed to Ghost the Dog, CO Dr. Ashworth's clinic. One card, drawn in crayon by a child named Ethan, showed a dog standing on 4 legs next to a motorcycle, with "You Can Do It, Ghost" written in uneven capitals across the sky. But the moment that broke something open came on a Saturday afternoon in late September. The Southwestern chapters had organized their annual memorial ride, a tradition honoring fallen members that typically drew 200 to 300 riders. This year, word circulated that the ride would stop at Dr. Ashworth's clinic. Dean expected maybe 100 bikes. 412 motorcycles rolled into Barstow that afternoon. They came from San Bernardino, Riverside, Pomona, Tucson, Phoenix, Mesa, Flagstaff, Needles, and a dozen smaller towns. They filled Main Street from the railroad tracks to the highway overpass, a river of chrome and leather and thunder that shook windows and set off car alarms. People came out of shops and houses to watch, not with the usual wariness, but with something closer to astonishment. The riders walked in groups into the clinic to see Ghost. Dr. Ashworth stood in her doorway and watched as men who looked like they could dismantle a building knelt on her tile floor and spoke in voices barely above a whisper to a dog that was learning to stand again. Because Ghost was standing. Not well, not steadily. The hind legs shook visibly, trembling with the effort of bearing weight they'd forgotten how to carry. But the legs were under the body, pushing against the floor. The nerves had reconnected. The muscles were slowly rebuilding under the regimen Marcus administered every evening. Range of motion exercises, warm compresses, short supported walks in the clinic's hallway where he held a towel sling under Ghost's belly while the dog relearned the mechanics of locomotion. When Ghost took 4 trembling steps across the exam room floor, watched by a crowd of leather-clad men pressed shoulder to shoulder in the hallway, nobody spoke. The click of the dog's nails on the tile was the loudest sound in the building. And when the dog's legs buckled on the 5th step and it sat down hard, panting, a giant of a man from the Tucson chapter, whose road name was Anvil, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and said, in a voice that cracked like dry wood, "That's the toughest thing I've ever seen." Nobody disagreed. 6 months later, Ghost could run. Not fast, and not without a hitch in its gait. The left hind leg would always be weaker than the right, a permanent asymmetry that left a distinctive track in the dust, 3 prints strong and 1 lighter, like a signature written in sand. But the dog could run, and it did every morning across the hard-packed dirt of the Desert Hawks compound, while Dean drank his coffee on the clubhouse steps and watched the sun come up over the Mojave. The compound had changed. Not dramatically. The fence was still there, the razor wire still caught the light, the Harleys still filled the parking lot every Thursday. But there was a new addition near the back gate. A fenced enclosure with a shade structure, water bowls, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Ghost's Yard." It had been built by chapter members over 2 weekends, using materials donated by the owner of Barstow Hardware. The same man who, 3 years earlier, had turned away club members who came in to buy lumber. The relationship between the Desert Hawks and Barstow hadn't transformed overnight into some storybook reconciliation. Trust that never existed doesn't rebuild on a single act of kindness. Prejudice isn't a switch that flips, it's a wall that comes down brick by brick, and some bricks are cemented with years of fear and the comfortable certainty that comes from never questioning your assumptions. There were still sideways looks when patched members walked into the grocery store. Still whispered conversations that stopped when a Harley rumbled past. Ray Whitfield still thought the club's resources would have been better spent elsewhere, and he said so openly, which was his right. His position wasn't cruelty, it was a hard-won conviction that sentimentality was a luxury poor men couldn't afford. Dean respected him for holding it out loud rather than nursing it in silence. But something had shifted. It was small, tentative and real. Dr. Ashworth began offering discounted veterinary services to the chapter's members, not out of charity, but out of what she called updated information. She'd seen how Marcus handled animals, how Dean showed up every morning without fail, how the club's members treated her clinic with a courtesy that was never performed and never demanded. She hired Marcus part-time as a veterinary assistant, a decision that generated a letter to the editor questioning the judgment of placing a Hells Angels member in a position of trust. Her response was characteristically direct. He's qualified, he's reliable, and he's better with animals than half the credentialed technicians I've interviewed in 22 years. Marcus accepted the job with a solemnity that those who knew him understood was joy. He worked 3 days a week at the clinic and continued his role with the chapter, bridging two worlds that had never known they needed a bridge. Sarah Mitchell's article had consequences beyond Barstow. A regional outlet picked it up, then a national one. Dean refused every follow-up interview. The story's been told, I'm not a performer. But the attention carried something tangible. The shelter in Needles received enough donations to fund another full year. A rescue organization in Los Angeles partnered with the Desert Hawks on animal transport runs. Volunteer rides ferrying dogs and cats from overcrowded desert shelters to foster homes in the city. The chapter voted unanimously to participate, including Ray Whitfield, who said simply, "If we're going to ride anyway, might as well carry something that matters." The fundraiser that November was the chapter's largest in 11 years. 314 families received boxes of food, winter clothing, and gift cards. For the first time, volunteers from outside the club showed up: a retired teacher, 2 nurses from the urgent care center, and 7 teenagers from the Baptist Church on Montara Road, who arrived at 7 in the morning and spent 4 hours sorting canned goods without complaint. Eddie Sullivan cooked for all of them. His brisket was, as always, extraordinary. Dean didn't make a speech. He stood near the back of the distribution line, handing out boxes with the same steady patience he brought to everything, and when someone thanked him, he nodded and moved to the next person. It was later that evening, after the last family had gone and the tables were being folded, that he sat on the clubhouse steps with Ghost lying beside him. The dog's head rested on its front paws, its body relaxed in the particular way of an animal that has decided, through the slow accumulation of consistent kindnesses, that it is safe. Eddie came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat down. They didn't speak for a while. The desert sky was turning purple at the edges, the first stars appearing like pinholes in dark fabric. "You know what gets me?" Eddie said. "What?" "Everybody in this town spent years being afraid of us, crossing the street, locking their doors, and the thing that changed their minds wasn't a speech or a PR campaign. It was a dog." Dean took a sip of his coffee. "It wasn't the dog. It was that they finally saw us do something they couldn't explain away." "Same thing." "No," Dean said quietly. "It's not. People ignore good deeds from people they've already decided are bad. They ignored the fundraiser for 11 years. 11 years of feeding their neighbors, and not one article, not one thank you from the city council." He paused. What they couldn't ignore was a broken thing getting back on its feet. Because that's a story everybody understands. Everybody's been broken. Everybody knows what it costs to stand up again. When they saw Ghost take those steps, they weren't seeing a dog. They were seeing themselves. Eddie considered this. "You think it'll last?" Dean watched the last light disappear behind the mountains. A coyote called somewhere in the distance, and Ghost's ears twitched, but its body remained still. "Some of it will," Dean said. "Some of it won't. People are complicated. That's not the point." "What is?" Dean set his coffee down and rested his hand on Ghost's back, feeling the rise and fall of the dog's breathing, the warmth of a life that had been measured in hours on a roadside 6 months ago and was now measured in years. "The point is, we stopped." The desert settled into darkness around them, vast and quiet and indifferent to the small, stubborn acts of decency that happened within it. The motorcycles gleamed in the compound's floodlights. The wind carried the faint sound of laughter from inside the clubhouse, where the rest of the chapter was cleaning up, arguing about whose turn it was to mop, living their lives in the way they had chosen, imperfect, unapologetic, and bound together by something stronger than reputation. Ghost sighed in its sleep and pressed closer to Dean's boot. Somewhere out on Ghost Town Road, the stars shone down on empty gravel, and the night erased every trace of what had happened there. But what had been carried away, the weight of a small broken body lifted by hands the world had already judged. The decision to stop when stopping cost something. The refusal to look away, that remained. It remained in the hands that had lifted, in the voices that had voted, in the 400 riders who had crossed the desert to bear witness to the stubborn, unspectacular miracle of one damaged creature learning to stand. It remained. And it was enough.